right, so this is the next lecture in the Phenomenology of Spirit series. If you're new to this series, I would definitely recommend checking out the first videos in this series, which cover the preface, the introduction, the chapters on consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason. In this section, we're going to be covering spirit. This is, again, a section which is directly following from Hegel's chapter on reason. So definitely check that out before watching this video if you want to sort of capture this sort of chapter in its logical progression. So covering the phenomenology of spirit, specifically the section on spirit. This section is a section which starts off focusing on a dialectical split of alienated spirituality, which is historically unique to the modern period, which is historically unique, you might say, to the emergence of Enlightenment consciousness. And in the emergence of Enlightenment consciousness, there is a split specifically between what we might call abstract reason, we might call disembodied reason, and faith or belief. And the structure of faith and belief for Hegel is embedded in the foundation of intimate community. So you here have a dialectical split, you might say, between individual, abstract universality of reason and embodied community, faith-based action. From that dialectical split, Hegel starts to work towards an understanding of spiritual morality. In that sense, spiritual morality for Hegel is what needs to be actively worked through by spirit as a spiritual work in the modern period. And from the working of spiritual morality as the work of spirit itself, again, between the split of abstract universality and intimate community, there is the inner notional discovery of conscience, the work of conscience, the formation of duty, and also the dialectical split which then reemerges within spirit as it relates to conflict between consciences. In the conflict between consciences, there is the problem of good and evil, which in fact Hegel attempts to dialectize as, you might say, a beyond of good and evil, and a first attempt to push towards what we might call religious consciousness, which is grounded for Hegel in the reconciliation and forgiveness. And towards the end of the chapter, we start to see what Hegel's God looks like in the acceptance, a sort of radical spiritual acceptance of duality, of a beyond of good and evil, which is consequently beyond rational consensus. So which kind of brings us full circle for this chapter, in fact, where we're starting with an alienated spirituality in disembodied reason. So let's start this chapter. So you have, on the one hand, logical side A and logical side B. If you followed the previous lectures in this series, Hegel's logic is the logic of A equals B. There's always two split sides which are attempting to work through their antagonism, work through their conflict. Again, with the start of this chapter, we're working through the conflict between Enlightenment subjectivity, which engages in an abstract life, which engages in what we might call disembodied reason, and which we see bring forth the individual citizen and the modern state. The individual citizen and the modern state as the foundation for modern consciousness is distinct and antagonistic with its opposite, here logical side B, which is faith, belief, which grounds the intimate concreteness of the community. We can here use the terms tribe or family, and Hegel specifically uses the sexuation of man and woman. And you can see here, at least in the context of this split, that many of the antagonisms between science and religion, many of the antagonisms between secularism and supernaturalism, let's say, are found in this split between the disembodied abstract individual citizen, the notion of enlightenment of the individual, of individual rights, individual freedoms, the formation of career-oriented individuals, professionals that are living in the abstract life of disembodied reason, and still the necessity to form families, that we are sexuated between man and woman, that we have a demand for intimacy, for connectivity on a deeper level in an embodied way. Many of the tensions in the modern world are found in the split between this form of subjectivity. So let's dive into Hegel's own thoughts on this split. Quote, "The living ethical world is spirit in its truth. When spirit first arrives at an abstract knowledge of its essence, ethical life is submerged in the formal universality of legality or law. Spirit is henceforth divided within itself, tracing one of its worlds in the harsh reality of its objective element and another over and against this realm. In the world of belief or faith, the realm of essential intimate being. In the form of abstract universality, it is the known law and the prevailing custom, which as a simple individuality, citizen, is that spirit as government. Confronting this clearly manifest ethical power, there is another power, the divine law, which governs the family. For the ethical power of the state finds its antithesis in the simple and immediate essence of the ethical sphere, the divine law, which has likewise on its side three differences within itself whose interrelationships constitute the living process of its actuality: husband and wife, parents and children, brothers and sisters." End quote. So in this quote, we see here that Hegel is saying that in the formation of the universality of law, in the formation of abstract individuality, again, this notion of the modern world of universal rights, the notion of individuality as fundamental, really as a separation from the pre-modern world, there is something lost in this positing by spirit, which is why Hegel says that spirit is henceforth divided within itself. The division, again, is between, on the one hand, this form of individuality which is trying to establish an objectivity in law, equal rights for everyone, and on the other hand, the side of consciousness, the side of spirit, which is dealing with its intimate being. And this division is something which Hegel says is, on the one hand, the embodiment of government in the abstract individual citizen, and on the other hand, the embodiment of what you might call the family spirit, the family man and the family woman, and their interrelationships. Husband and wife, parents and children, brothers and sisters. Now, in Hegel's language, what we're dealing with here, on the one hand, is secular law in the government and what he's calling divine law, which is the family law. So, again, this tension between secularism and divinity, this tension between secularism and religiosity, is starting to make its appearance very clearly in Hegel with this antagonism. So let's continue on as Hegel attempts to work through this antagonism. So on the one hand, the side of the abstract law, the side of the individual citizen, we here see that Hegel notices the lack in this side as the heart's alienation, meaning that the abstract individual and the life of the universal citizen comes at a cost, which is the heart. That the individual who becomes the abstract citizen is alienated from his heart, and that the abstractions which that individual is positing and acting out mean nothing, are a pure emptiness without concrete implementation. Then on the other side, you have the life of faith and belief in the family, what Hegel is calling particular piety, and the action of the heart. And here we have abstract alienation. So again, you have the traditional or the stereotypical distinction between the intelligent individualist, modern individual, and the sort of familial, heart-centric subject who is intellectually out of touch or simply living behind the times, so to speak. So you have, on the one hand, the alienation of the heart, on the other hand, the alienation of abstraction. And the reason for this alienation of abstraction, according to Hegel, is that the heart has a indifference to the external and the literal. Whereas, of course, the abstract universal is only caring about the external and the literal, as opposed to, for example, the internal and the metaphorical. Whereas for the heart, the internal and the metaphorical is fundamental. So this split here, whatever side the subject falls upon, has a great cost and a feeling of lack. Let's quote Hegel on this distinction. Spirit is the consciousness of an objective real world, freely existing on its own abstract universal, but is confronted by the unity of actual consciousness by pure consciousness, heart's faith. Consequently, this spirit constructs for itself a world that is double, divided, and self-opposed, i.e. family and nation. The equilibrium of the whole rests on the alienation of opposites and is therefore a self-alienated actuality, falling apart into a realm in which self-consciousness as well as its object is actual, objective real world, and into another, realm of pure consciousness, which, lying beyond the first, is not a present actuality but exists only for faith. In its hostility to faith, as the alien realm of essence lying in the beyond, it is the Enlightenment. This Enlightenment completes the alienation of spirit in this realm and upsets the housekeeping of spirit in the household of faith by bringing into that household the tools and utensils of this world, end quote. So in this passage, you see, on the one hand, he's saying that the abstract, universal, individual citizen is existing in what it's calling the objective real world, with freedom as its goal, but that it is confronted by its opposite, which is a type of pure consciousness of the heart. And that this division again sets up the subjectivities which are embodying the family and the nation. However, the family and the nation are resting on an alienation of opposites. And so this alienation of opposites is going through a specific, what I would call asymmetrical tension. And the asymmetry is that the household is being dominated by the Enlightenment consciousness. And the Enlightenment consciousness, this is in the part where Hegel is saying that the Enlightenment consciousness is, quote unquote, upsetting the housekeeping of spirit and the household of faith. And specifically what this is doing to the faith-based consciousness, the pure consciousness, is, and why it's an asymmetry, is it's forcing upon the household consciousness, it's forcing upon the family and the heart, the demands of utilitarianism and utilitarian consciousness. So let's see what Hegel does dialectically with this notion that faith and belief and pure consciousness must come to face the utilitarianism of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment forces upon consciousness as a whole usefulness towards human ends and casts all skepticism possible, casts all criticism possible onto faith and belief in a beyond. This is again the classical distinction between secular consciousness and religious or supernatural consciousness. And the whole point of that tension for Hegel is the forcing upon all consciousness of a type of utilitarian principle. Now, Hegel accepts the universality of this utilitarianism, but he, of course, identifies a dialectical flaw in utilitarianism. And that dialectical flaw is, quote unquote, a unsatisfied yearning, which is inherent to enlightenment. And this unsatisfied yearning inherent to enlightenment is that enlightenment consciousness, abstract universality, the individual citizen has become alienated from its heart. And this emptiness is where the unsatisfied yearning situates itself and grounds the logic of utility. In other words, utilitarianism is not the final term, but rather what is being put in service to the filling of emptiness. The actualization of utilitarian notions, therefore, is ultimately leading towards not something external and literal, but rather the internal discovery of a truer self-insight. Let's quote Hegel on this. In this negative activity of enlightenment, pure insight at the same time realizes itself and produces its own object, the unknowable absolute being, negative, and the principle of utility, positive. Enlightenment itself bears within it this blemish of an unsatisfied yearning. In its empty absolute being, in the lack of selfhood in the thing that is useful. While the useful does express the notion of pure insight, it is not pure insight as such, but insight conceived by it in the form of object. But returned into itself, that notion is pure insight. What is thus lacking is obtained in utility insofar as pure insight there acquires positive objectivity. Pure insight is thereby an actual consciousness satisfied within itself. This insight is thus a true knowing, where truth as well as presence and actuality are united. The two worlds are reconciled, and heaven is transplanted to earth below. End quote. So you here see how Hegel has worked through dialectically the tension between abstract universality of the modern individual citizen, alienated from his heart, her heart, or her heart, and the intimate community, the faith-based community, which is alienated from abstract universality. Through the telos of utilitarianism, but with utilitarianism being forced to situate itself in the cultivation of pure insight, since utility is more the product of insight, but not insight itself. And so utilitarianism finds its reconciliation in the cultivation of pure insight, which Hegel claims is a actual consciousness satisfied within itself. And that this reconciles heaven and earth on the side of bringing heaven to earth. So here is those three dialectical relationships. On the one hand, family and state, the tension between family and state in intimacy and abstraction. The irreducible conflict between the two of them, which is reconciled in concrete implementation, again, utilitarianism. And the abstract having to come to terms with the unsatisfied yearning. And that in this situation of utilitarianism, in the unsatisfied yearning, there is the cultivation of pure insight. So again, it's not pragmatic utility for pragmatic utility's sake. It's pragmatic utility for pure insight. Let's move on. So, in the cultivation of pure insight, we have here a push towards what Hegel is going to be calling dutiful subjectivity. Again, cultivation of pure insight through utilitarianism is leading to dutiful subjectivity. And dutiful subjectivity is a conscious reconciliation of what Hegel's calling blind obedience to either the state or the family. The state are the daylight laws, again, abstract universality, which are in some sense missing concrete implementation with the heart. And also blind obedience to the family, which Hegel is calling underground laws, which are the laws of the heart, which are in some sense missing their connection to abstract universality. So the problem for dutiful subjectivity, Hegel recognizes, is on the one hand, basically two forms of harmony. On the one hand, morality and nature, that nature is immoral. And on the other hand, morality and what he's calling sensuous will, that our will is immoral. So what dutiful subjectivity is tarrying with, and where we'll have another dialectical split, is the inexistence of perfect morality. And we'll work more with that. But let's quote Hegel on this formation now. Self-consciousness knows duty to be the absolute essence. It is bound only by duty, and this substance is its own pure consciousness. The first postulate of duty was the harmony of morality and objective nature, the final purpose of the world. The other, the harmony of morality and the sensuous will, the final purpose of self-consciousness as such. But what connects as middle term these postulated two extreme final purposes is the movement of actual conduct itself. In this action, the moral view of the world is completed. In the moral view of the world we see, consciousness itself consciously produces its object. It proceeds in every case in accordance with the principle on the basis of which it posits objective being. It thus knows this latter to be its own self, for it knows itself to be the active agent that produces it. It seems therefore to attain here its peace and satisfaction, for this can only be found where it no longer needs to go beyond its object, because this no longer goes beyond it. End quote. So here Hegel's saying that self-consciousness comes to know itself as duty, but that this duty is in turn struggling with harmony of morality, both the morality on the natural objective side and the harmony on the sensuous will side. And that the work of morality, again, you might connect this to the empty yearning, a yearning in emptiness, where emptiness here is the imperfect morality, comes to know a deeper peace and satisfaction from attempting to actualize this morality, because it is the self's own work. This is why the self is here, to do this work. That's why Hegel says it no longer goes beyond its object, because this no longer goes beyond it. However, there's a problem. That the morality that the dutiful subjectivity is attempting to actualize is a perfect impossibility. Namely, here, what the dutiful subjectivity thinks it will actualize as a perfect morality is nothing but, quote unquote, a whole nest of contradictions, namely a imperfect actuality. So the moral worldview basically runs into deeper and deeper problems of its own self-contradictory, and we might also say hypocritical nature. To be specific in regards to the ultimate aim of this perfect morality, the world and will as a moral unity, what I'm placing here as an impossible telos, is basically what the consciousness would recognize as endless survival or immortality, indefinite moral progress or the cultivation of the good, and eternal happiness that is good feeling, positive emotion. But this, again, Hegel's saying, is impossible and runs into, quote unquote, a whole nest of contradictions, and we'll here get that directly from Hegel's own text. Quote, however, consciousness itself really places the object outside of itself as a beyond of itself. The moral worldview is, therefore, in fact, nothing other than the elaboration of this fundamental contradiction in its various aspects. It is, to employ here a Kantian expression where it is most appropriate, a whole nest of thoughtless contradictions. Consciousness itself shifts perfect morality away into infinity, i.e., asserts that the perfection is never perfected. What consciousness really holds to the truth of the matter is only this immediate state of imperfection, a state nonetheless which at least is supposed to be a progress towards perfection. It knows its morality to be imperfect because it is affected by the sense nature and nature opposed to it, which in part adulterate morality itself as such, and in part give rise to a host of duties by which, in concrete cases of real action, it is embarrassed. What finally is posited to be absolute is pure duty, and the knowledge of duty as essence, end quote. So he's basically saying that the moral worldview is fundamentally flawed in a, again, I think a great expression, a whole nest of thoughtless contradictions, and that then the consciousness becomes even more deeply divided in itself between the perfect morality shifted into infinity and its actual concrete situations where Hegel says it is embarrassed. So this is a very emotionally disruptive and divisive discovery for consciousness. But that what consciousness ultimately comes to in this is this knowledge of pure duty, which we need to go into deeper. And what here he's saying pure duty is a pure duty which is untethered to or unbothered by the moral presuppositions of its own consciousness. Let's go into that. This is where we push from the moral view of the world to what Hegel's calling the law of conscience, which is not necessarily tied to this impossible morality, the moral unity of nature and will, but simply pure duty of simple action. So it massively, from the confrontation with a whole nest of thoughtless contradictions, consciousness massively simplifies itself in pure duty and the formation of its own notional necessity, which is more about, again, simple action than getting caught up in big ideals, let's say. And conscientiousness, as pure duty and simple action, renounces the way in which contradiction and hypocrisy, self-contradiction and self-hypocrisy, lead to passivity, which is, for Hegel, even a worse situation than the whole nest of contradictions themselves. The whole nest of contradictions are really what brings consciousness to a simplification of itself. So let's go quote from Hegel. Moral self-consciousness, having attained its truth in pure insight as pure duty, abandons or rather supersedes the internal division which gave rise to the dissemblance. The division between the in itself and the self, between pure duty qua pure purpose, and reality qua nature and sense opposed to pure purpose. Conscience dominates as the negative one, or absolute self, which does away with these various moral substances. It is simple action in accordance with duty, which fulfills not this or that duty, but knows and does what is concretely right. It is, therefore, first of all, moral action qua action, into which the previous moral consciousness that did not act has passed. It renounces all these attitudes and dissemblances connected with the moral view of the world when it renounces that consciousness which thinks of duty and reality as contradictory. It is now the law that exists for the sake of the self, not the self that exists for the sake of the law." End quote. So a few important points here is that the moral consciousness gives rise to a huge division within itself between its actual state and an impossible perfection. However, this perfect image gets destroyed. What comes to take its place is what he calls a negative one, or absolute self, and that is what grounds the law of conscience. And from the law of conscience, the moral consciousness, its attitudes and dissemblances, again connected to the moral worldview, fall away, and what we get is a simple self. How Hegel ends this passage by saying, we get a law that exists for the sake of the self. That is the law of conscience. So, from deep reflection in itself, we have, again, pure insight. We got pure insight from the universalization of utilitarianism. From this pure insight, we get consciousness reflecting on a perfect morality. We get consciousness trying to enact that perfect morality, again, uniting nature and will and finding nothing but contradictions between the perfect notion and reality. And from this failure of the perfect notion and reality, we have a even further deepening of consciousness in the conscience and the law of the conscience, where it finds simple action in pure duty as opposed to upholding and defending some big, complex moral worldview. Moving on, we have here a battle of species of conscience. We are working here in the law of conscience. And in the law of conscience, again, we have a way in which another division emerges. You can really see here how Hegel's dialectic functions. Hegel's dialectic is always producing a new division, and is this processual division as such. In this division, we have the acting duty, which in itself is simple action, and which calls itself good, which calls itself perhaps right. And we have the other consciousness, the other conscience, which will judge that duty. And the division between consciences is that one action which a conscience views as right and true, another consciousness will view as evil and wrong, and we have the emergence of irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable differences, this is in the law of conscience, is really responsible, of course, for most divorces. Irreconcilable differences is the result of most battles between consciousness. You can have two consciences which are in themselves living up to their notion, living up to their duty for what they believe is right, and you will still have the emergence of this problem of good and evil, of irreconcilable differences, and the emotional turmoil that can emerge as a consequence of this irreconcilable difference. Let's go to Hegel. This right thing which conscience does is at the same time a being for another, and thus it seems that a disparity attaches to conscience. The duty which it fulfills is the self of consciousness, but once fulfilled, set in the medium of being, the action is a specific action, not identical with the element of everyone's self-consciousness, and therefore not necessarily acknowledged. Both sides, the conscience that acts and the universal consciousness that acknowledges this action as duty, are equally free from the specificity of this action. On account of this freedom, their relationship in the common medium of their connection is really a relation of complete disparity. The latter acts, it gives being to a specific content. Others hold to this being as the spirit's truth, and are therein certain of this spirit. It has declared therein what it holds to be duty. Others, therefore, do not know whether this conscience is morally good or evil." End quote. So we here see that the problem that conscience has, and the problem inherent to the law of conscience, is that the individual self-consciousness is not only acting for itself, but for another, and cannot control what that other thinks about its own duty and its own action. On the other side, the judging conscience cannot tell if the simple action of the other is in fact morally good or evil, and in fact has to presuppose that the other is acting in an evil way. So, this battle between species of conscience, action and judgment, good and evil, is a pure determination of opposites, where one conscience can say, "I'm acting in the good," and the other can say, casting a judgment, that that action is evil, and vice versa. Both consciences in their action can see their action as good, whereas both judgers can see the other's actions as evil. Hegel's working through of this contradiction is that the condemning other, the judging other, is in fact condemning his or herself, and that the spirit must work towards a higher order understanding of good and evil, which comes about in forgiveness. But this working towards higher order forgiveness is a really complicated spiritual mess, and also an element where we may say there is the risk of spiritual bypassing. If it's not done authentically in the image, where there's really a recognition of the higher order nature of good and evil. In any case, let's hear what Hegel has to say specifically about the relationship between the self and the other when it comes to both the condemning judgment and the possibility of forgiveness. Quote, "In denouncing hypocrisy as base, it is appealing in such judgment to its own law, just as the evil consciousness appeals to its law. Now, though, this judgment it places itself alongside the first acting consciousness. For the judging consciousness of duty maintains an attitude of passive apprehension, but it is thereby in contradiction with itself as the absolute will of duty. The true, the self-conscious and existent equalization of the two sides, action and judgment, is necessitated by the breaking of the hard heart and the raising of it to universality. The forgiveness which it extends to the other is the renunciation of itself, and acknowledges that what thought characterized as bad, viz. Action, is good, or rather it abandons this distinction, just as the other abandons its subjective characterization of action as good. The word of reconciliation is the objectively existent spirit, a reciprocal recognition." End quote. So, what Hegel's saying ultimately is that the judging consciousness is basically in the wrong because it is a passive apprehension. In other words, that it is not pure duty, that judgment is not a part of action. And so the passive judgment is itself in needs of letting itself go, what he calls forgiveness in renunciation of itself, renunciation of its own judgment of the other as evil. And this is in the quote-unquote breaking of the hard heart. Again, this is all spiritual work, and when we say spiritual work, we're talking about the work of the heart, which is beyond rational negotiation, beyond rational reconciliation. What's interesting is that what the judging consciousness viewed as bad is in fact good. If we're dealing here with two actors which are abiding by the law of the conscience. And that, again, what Hegel's ultimately pushing towards here is something like a beyond of good and evil. Now, this beyond of good and evil, as I understand it, is similar to Nietzsche's notion in Beyond Good and Evil, that what we call evil is merely a direct expression, a more direct expression of the good. And what we call good is kind of like a sublation or a sublimation of evil. But they're really part of the same process, and they're ultimately the same thing, which is again why we have to say there's a beyond of good and evil and this distinction. And that the working through this distinction on the part of judgment requires a letting of itself go and seeing what was bad as possibly what was in fact part of the good from a higher order point of view. So you have the possibility in this forgiveness to a higher order discovery of self, which Hegel starts to point towards as God, as the I in duality. What I think Hegel means by this, and we'll get to a direct quote in a moment, is that the I and the self are distinct, and that the I needs to be connected with very deeply in order to accept duality fully. And that's the paradox, is that in order to be one, two-ness needs to be fully accepted. And until two-ness as the working through of good and evil, until two-ness in the working through good and evil is accepted, there is no real connection with what Hegel's calling God. And consequently, no real understanding in consciousness for what Hegel will point towards as religion. And in that sense, for the subjectivity, for the consciousness, which has yet to fully accept duality, there is really no possibility for the Hegelian notion of God and the Hegelian notion of religion. So let's work through this final passage by Hegel. Spirit enters into existence only at that point where its pure knowledge about itself is the antithesis and alternation of its dual aspect. Each of these two self-certain spirits has no other purpose than its own pure self, and no other reality in existence than just this pure self. But yet they are different, and the difference is absolute because it is set in this element of the pure notion. Consequently, they are these sheer opposites for one another. It is the completely inner being which thus confronts its own self and enters into outer existence. The reconciling yea, in which the two I's let go of their antithetical existence, is the existence of the I which is expanded into duality, and therein remains identical with itself, and in its complete externalization and opposite, possess the certainty of itself. It is God manifested in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge. End quote. So again, I think, to reiterate what I was saying in the past slide, spirit working through good and evil has to come to a reconciliation of duality, and to basically see itself in absolute difference. Come to see what it formerly saw as the worst evil, and to see itself in that. To come to see what formerly provoked the deepest emotional heartbreak as its own self. And this is in what Hegel's calling a reconciling yea, in which the two I's let go of their antithetical existence. And then I think another great passage where he's saying, the existence of the I which has expanded into a duality, and therein remains identical with itself. So in other words, there's no problem anymore for the I to expand into the dualistic world, because it knows it cannot lose itself, and it will not lose itself in duality. No matter how much difference it confronts in this externalization and opposition. And this is pointing towards, as Hegel said himself, his own notion of God as manifest, God as actual in the historical process. So here is the different levels of conscience and the moral life. We have irreconcilable differences between species of conscience, a contradiction between evil actions and condemning judgment. We have the pushing towards reconciliation of these irreconcilable differences in the breaking of the hard heart. And in this, we have the emergence of what I'm calling here the dual I of God. The God which can actualize itself and manifest itself fully in duality. And that is, in the acceptance of duality, we are capable of, might say, being rational in a situation which is beyond rational consensus or possibility for rational unity between two absolute differences. And that brings us to the end of that chapter, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. This chapter focused on spirit, and you'll see in the side there that in previous lectures we covered the foreword, not the preface. I made a mistake in the beginning. The foreword, the introduction, the chapter on consciousness, the chapter on self-consciousness, the chapter on reason, and that brings us to this current lecture, which you've just worked through, the chapter on spirit. I will just end by saying that if you want to support this work, you can support me on Patreon. There's a link in the description if you want to continue helping me. And other than that, I would like to simply thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. And I hope that this was a useful and productive overview of Hegel's chapter on spirit. Thank you very much.